The air in the remote village in valley, single road in and out, always tasted of damp earth and wood smoke, a comforting, familiar perfume that used to soothe me. Now it just felt heavy, like the sky pressing down, a constant, suffocating weight. I'd retreated here after Sarah, after he was gone. The city, with its sharp edges and relentless noise, was too much. This place, nestled deep in the folds of the mountains, offered a quiet I craved, a silence that echoed the emptiness inside me. My little cottage was a sanctuary of sorts. Books were stacked precariously on every surface, their spines worn and pages dog-eared. The scent of old paper mingled with the ever-present wood smoke. My desk, usually a battlefield of equations and star charts, was now dominated by a single, unopened box of Sarah's things. I'd been meaning to go through it for months. Every time my gaze landed on it, a familiar ache bloomed in my chest, sharp and sudden. I'd push it away, burying myself in the celestial dance I'd once found so exhilarating. Astrophysics. It had been my life, my passion, my escape. The vastness of the cosmos, the elegant physics that governed its sprawling expanse, it was a universe I understood. Unlike the messy, unpredictable terrain of human emotion, the stars followed laws, predictable and unwavering. Or so I'd thought. I still kept a small observatory on the hill behind my cottage. A relic of my former life, really. The telescope, a powerful refractor I'd spent years calibrating, sat gathering dust. I hadn't looked through it since I'd arrived. What was the point? The stars had always been a constant, a backdrop to the fleeting drama of human existence. Now they seemed indifferent, their distant light a cold comfort. My days here had settled into a routine. Wake with the sun, a solitary breakfast of strong coffee and dry toast, then hours spent poring over old research papers, trying to rekindle a spark of intellectual curiosity. The grief was a dull thrum beneath it all, a constant companion. One particularly grey afternoon, the kind that settled over the valley like a shroud, I found myself staring at the unopened box. Sarah had kept mementos in it, a faded concert ticket, a pressed flower, a small, tarnished silver locket. My fingers traced the grain of the wood, a phantom warmth spreading through my hand. Enough, I told myself. I needed to face it. With a sigh that felt too heavy for my lungs, I knelt and lifted the lid. The scent of lavender and old paper rose, a ghost of Sarah's presence. I gently lifted out a bundle of letters, tied with a ribbon. Then a small, velvet-lined case. It glinted dully in the dim light. Beneath it, I found a small, leather-bound notebook. It was Sarah's. Not her journal, she kept those hidden, but a collection of her sketches and observations. She'd been an artist, a keen observer of the world. I'd always admired her ability to see beauty in the mundane. I opened the notebook. The pages were filled with her elegant, looping script, interspersed with intricate drawings of plants, birds, and the occasional, surprisingly detailed sketch of the night sky. I flipped through the pages, a bittersweet ache in my throat. Then I stopped. A page near the back was different. The script was still Sarah's, but the content was odd. It wasn't a drawing of a flower or a bird. It was a series of symbols, geometric and abstract, unlike anything I'd ever seen. Beneath them, scrawled in a hurried hand, were a few lines of text. The hum is getting louder. It's not static. It's a signal. From where, I don't know, but it's watching. My brow furrowed. Sarah had always had a vivid imagination, a creative mind that could conjure wonders, but this, it felt different. The symbols were precise, almost mathematical in their complexity, and the words, watching. I turned the page, more symbols, and then a single stark sentence. It's not just looking. I remembered Sarah mentioning strange dreams, fleeting sensations of being observed. I dismissed them as stress, as the anxieties of a mind stretched too thin by her illness. But this notebook, this felt like something more. I closed the notebook, my hands trembling slightly. The pendant lay in its case, its unfamiliar constellation seeming to mark me with its silent, alien geometry. The hum, a signal, watching, listening. The words echoed in the quiet of the cottage, each one a tiny shard of ice. I looked out the window at the mist-shrouded peaks. The remote village in valley, single road in and out, had always felt so isolated, so protected. But what if the isolation was an illusion? There was Sarah's artistic fancy merely that, or had she glimpsed something truly other? The pages of Sarah's notebook felt brittle beneath my fingertips. Dust motes danced in the weak beam of my headlamp, illuminating faded ink that spoke of things I'd once believed impossible. She'd been charting patterns. She'd written, not in the stars, but in the gaps between them. In the silence. I traced a diagram, a spiraling fractal that seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy. It mirrored, disturbingly, the chaotic beauty of the nebulae I'd spent my life studying. But this was different, more intimate, as if it were drawn from the inside out. The air in the abandoned observatory was thick with the scent of decay and ozone. My breath plumed in front of me, a stark white ghost against the deepening gloom. This remote village in valley, single road in and out, had always felt like the edge of the world. Now, surrounded by Sarah's cryptic scribblings, it felt like the edge of something far more profound and far more terrifying. I remembered her hushed whispers, her eyes wide with a fear that had nothing to do with her failing body. She'd spoken of a hum, a pervasive resonance that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of existence. I'd attributed it to her fever, to the medication. It was a testament to a mind grappling with something real. I spent the rest of the night poring over her notes, cross-referencing her observations with my own archived data. The anomalies I'd dismissed as instrument errors, as cosmic background noise, began to coalesce. There were faint, rhythmic pulses in the quantum foam, subtle deviations in the redshift of distant quasars that defied conventional explanation. Sarah had seen it too. By dawn, the weak sunlight filtering through the grimy dome offered little comfort. My eyes burned, my head throbbed, but a new kind of clarity was settling in. It wasn't the clean, logical clarity of astrophysics, but a raw, visceral understanding. Sarah hadn't been dreaming. She'd been seeing. And what she'd seen was now seeping into my reality. I decided to rerun the analysis on the deep field data from the Andromeda sector, the same dataset that had yielded the initial, unsettling readings. I isolated the specific frequency band Sarah had marked in her notebook, a narrow spectrum that had previously registered as inert. My fingers flew across the console, the familiar click of the keys, a small anchor in the rising tide of unease. The first few minutes were uneventful, just the usual static, the faint murmur of the universe at rest. I leaned back, a weary sigh escaping my lips. Perhaps it was all a delusion, a shared hallucination born of grief and isolation. The thought was a bitter pill, but a part of me craved its simplicity. Then it began. A faint tremor, barely perceptible at first, rippled through the data feed. It wasn't a spike, not a sudden burst of energy. It was subtler, a harmonic distortion that spread like ink on water. The rhythmic pulses Sarah had documented began to manifest, not as faint echoes, but as clear, undeniable signals. They were complex, layered, far beyond anything a natural phenomenon could produce. It was a language, or something akin to it, spoken in the dialect of cosmic law. My heart, which I'd thought was too heavy with sorrow to beat with such urgency, began to thrum against my ribs. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath catching in my throat. The signals intensified, coalescing into intricate patterns that mirrored the fractal in Sarah's notebook. It was as if the universe itself was responding to her meticulous observations, as if her charting of its hidden language had drawn its attention. The light on the console flickered, a brief, almost apologetic interruption. When it returned, the data stream had shifted. The rhythmic pulses were no longer confined to the specific frequency band, they were everywhere. They permeated the entire dataset, a pervasive, interwoven tapestry of alien intelligence. The sheer scale of it was staggering, the implications crushing. This wasn't just a scientific curiosity, it was an awakening that felt less like discovery and more like being discovered. The temperature in the observatory plummeted. The air itself seemed to thicken, to press down on me. I could feel the weight of it, the immense, indifferent gaze of something that had existed long before stars were born. The hum Sarah had described was no longer a phantom sensation. It was real. It was in the air, in the metal of the console, in the very marrow of my bones. I looked at the screen, at the impossible patterns unfolding before me. They were beautiful, terrifyingly so. They spoke of a power that dwarfed human understanding, of a consciousness that operated on scales I couldn't comprehend. The air in the small study of the rented cottage was thick with the scent of damp wool and something vaguely metallic, like old coins. I'd been here in this remote village in Valley, single road in and out, for 3 days, the silence outside broken only by the bleating of distant sheep and the sigh of the wind through the jagged peaks that ringed us. It was a place meant for forgetting, but Sarah's notebook had become a new kind of obsession, a beacon in the fog of my grief. Her handwriting, usually so precise, was frantic in places. She'd drawn diagrams, not of celestial bodies, but of connections, lines that didn't correspond to any known physical forces. She called them resonances. I traced a particularly complex web of scribbles with my finger. The numbers she'd annotated were astronomical, but not in the way I understood. They weren't magnitudes or distances. They were frequencies. I pulled out my own laptop, its screen a harsh blue in the dim light. The data I'd downloaded from the observatory archives was a tangled mess. Anomalies, glitches, statistical outliers that had been dismissed as instrument error. But Sarah's notes gave them context. She'd cross-referenced these faint signals with her own theoretical framework, a framework I'd once scoffed at. Now, I felt a cold prickle crawl up my spine. I started feeding her numbers into my analysis software. The processing cycles churned, the fans whirring a low hum that seemed to amplify the stillness of the room. Hours bled into each other. The sky outside shifted from bruised twilight to absolute black. I brewed more coffee, the bitter taste doing little to sharpen my focus. It was the pattern that was so maddening, not just the presence of these faint signals, but their behavior. They weren't random, they pulsed, they shifted, they seemed responsive. Then it happened. A cluster of anomalies previously flagged as noise suddenly coalesced. They flared, a momentary spike in the endless graph, just as I input a specific sequence of Sarah's frequency notations. It was like hitting a tuning fork and hearing a distant echo. My breath hitched. This wasn't an error. This was a response. I repeated the sequence, faster this time, the same spike. Then another and another, each one a tiny, almost imperceptible ripple in the vast ocean of data. Sarah had written about a sentient vacuum, an idea so outlandish it had been relegated to the fringe theories of theoretical physics. But what if he was right? What if the spaces between things weren't empty? What if they were occupied? My hands began to shake. I looked at the screen, at the faint, pulsing lines that seemed to mirror the frantic beat of my own heart. These weren't just cosmic phenomena. They were signals, and they were being answered. I scrolled through Sarah's notes, my eyes darting from her diagrams to the data on my screen. He had hypothesized that these resonances weren't just passive observations. They were a form of communication, or perhaps something even more ancient, a fundamental interaction with existence. My gaze fell on a passage I'd skimmed over before, dismissed as poetic rambling. It doesn't create, he had written. It unmakes, it reorders. It is the entropy made manifest, the quiet hum that precedes dissolution. The words felt heavy, charged with an unseen weight. I typed a new query into the search bar, a string of prime numbers, a universal constant I'd always found comforting. The software churned. Nothing. I tried another sequence, a Fibonacci series. Still nothing. Then, on a desperate impulse, I entered a series of numbers that Sarah had circled repeatedly in her notebook, numbers that had no mathematical significance I could discern. The screen flickered. A single, anomalous data point appeared. It was isolated, stark against the black background, unlike anything I had seen before. It pulsed with a faint internal light. And then slowly, deliberately, it began to expand, not across the screen, but inwards, as if it were drawing something towards it. My throat tightened. The metallic scent in the air grew stronger, cloying. I could feel a subtle vibration emanating from the laptop, a low thrum that seemed to resonate in my teeth. It wasn't just data anymore. It felt alive. I pushed back from the desk, my chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The sound was jarring, intrusive. I looked around the small room, at the stacks of books, at the empty coffee mug, at the framed photograph of Sarah on the mantelpiece. Everything felt fragile, as if it could all be reordered, unmade at any moment. The pulsing on the screen intensified. The single data point was no longer alone. They were forming a shape, a pattern, a shape that looked eerily familiar. It was a distorted echo of one of Sarah's most complex resonance diagrams. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't an observation. It was a conversation. And I, Thomas, had just inadvertently invited something into the room. But what was it that had answered my clumsy query, and what did it want with this quiet corner of the world? The metallic tang in the air of my study grew sharper, more insistent. It clung to the rough-hewn wood of the desk, to the worn pages of the books I'd brought with me. Each breath felt like I was inhaling rust, a slow, internal decay mirroring the data I was sifting through. The silence of the remote village in valley, single road in and out, was no longer a comfort, but a vast, expectant hush. The bleating of sheep, once a faint murmur, now sounded like tiny, desperate cries swallowed by the immense quiet. I'd spent the last 2 nights staring at the holographic projections, the star charts that pulsed with an unnatural light. The anomalies, faint at first, had begun to coalesce. It wasn't just a whisper in the cosmic static. It was a chorus, a symphony of impossible frequencies. My initial exhilaration, the thrill of a discovery that could redefine everything, had long since curdled into a cold, creeping dread. I was alone in this rented cottage, the only soul for miles, and the weight of the universe felt like it was pressing down on my chest. My fingers, stained with ink and the phantom residue of whatever strange energy emanated from the data, traced the lines of a spectral analysis. It was a record, ancient and fragmented, of a stellar nursery in the Andromeda galaxy. Standard stellar formation, I'd thought, until I saw it. A pattern, impossibly regular, woven into the very fabric of the nascent stars. Not a natural phenomenon, not a random fluctuation. It was deliberate. I zoomed in, the holographic dust motes swirling around my head. The pattern repeated across dozens of stellar bodies, each instance subtly different, yet undeniably linked. It was like a signature, etched into creation itself. I cross-referenced the timestamps, the galactic coordinates. This wasn't a recent event. This predated humanity by eons. My breath hitched. I remembered the conversation with the colleague, his dismissive tone, his insistence on the limitations of our current understanding. He couldn't have conceived of this. No one could. This was not the work of a single advanced civilization. This was something far older, far more pervasive. A force, an architect. I pulled up another data stream, a radio telescope feed from a defunct lunar outpost. It had been dismissed as background noise, a corrupted transmission. But the frequencies, the modulated pulses, they matched. Not perfectly, but with an uncanny resonance. The same signature, fainter now, distorted by distance and time, but unmistakably present. It was like finding a single word from a forgotten language, and then realizing that word was the key to an entire lexicon. My own internal rhythm began to falter. The quiet hum of the projector seemed to amplify, to take on a new, sinister quality. It was the sound of something waiting. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if unseen eyes were fixed upon me, even here, in the desolate quiet of this valley. I pushed aside the spectral analysis and brought up a visual representation of the cosmic microwave background. For years, it had been the bedrock of our understanding of the universe's infancy. But now, with the filter of the discovered pattern, I could see it. Subtle variations, microscopic distortions that had been overlooked or perhaps deliberately ignored. They were the faint echoes of that same signature, spread across the entire observable universe. It was a profound, existential unease. This entity, this cosmic sculptor, hadn't just appeared. It had been here, weaving its influence through the very warp and weft of existence from its earliest moments. It had shaped galaxies, guided the birth of stars, and perhaps it had guided the genesis of life itself. The metallic smell intensified, now carrying a hint of ozone, sharp and acrid. My vision blurred for a moment, the holographic stars seeming to swim before my eyes. The distant bleating of sheep had stopped. I felt a profound sense of insignificance, a speck of dust caught in a hurricane of incomprehensible power. My wife, Sarah. Her loss had felt like the end of my universe. Now I understood. My universe was merely a canvas, and the artist had been at work long before I ever drew breath. My hands trembled as I reached for another data file. This one was from a deep space probe, lost decades ago in the Kuiper belt. Its final transmission, a garbled mess of telemetry and static, had been attributed to a catastrophic systems failure. But I had a hunch, a terrible, gnawing certainty. The file opened. The static resolved into a series of pulses, and then a faint, distorted echo of that signature, louder this time, closer. Was it merely observing, or was it actively listening to my discoveries? The metallic tang was a constant companion now, a coppery breath that filled my lungs and coated my tongue. It was strongest in my study, here in this God-forsaken remote village in valley, single road in and out, where the air itself seemed to thicken with the unseen. The data streams, once crisp lines of code and stellar coordinates, now swam before my eyes, blurred by exhaustion and a growing, gnawing unease. The silence here was profound, broken only by the distant bleating of sheep and the wind sighing through the skeletal pines that clawed at the bruised twilight sky. I'd retreated here hoping for solitude, for the quiet necessary to untangle the cosmic knot I'd found. But solitude had brought its own brand of company. The anomaly, a ripple in the fabric of space-time that defied all known physics, was no longer just a theoretical curiosity. It was a presence. I felt it in the way the hairs on my arms prickled, in the sudden, irrational urge to glance over my shoulder. The data was a Rosetta Stone, painstakingly deciphered, and the inscription it revealed spoke of something vast, something ancient and something aware. My wife, Elena, her laughter a distant echo I strained to recall, would have told me I was chasing shadows. But Elena was gone. The anomaly wasn't a fluke, it was a signal. And we, in our tiny corner of the universe, had apparently answered. I'd cross-referenced the anomalous energy signatures with every known celestial event, every stellar life cycle, every theoretical cosmic phenomenon. Nothing, until I started looking at the timing. The patterns were maddeningly subtle at first, a faint correlation, easily dismissed as coincidence. But as I fed more data into the algorithms, as I pushed my aging processors to their absolute limit, the correlation sharpened. It wasn't just a correlation, it was a deliberate alignment. The anomaly pulsed with a rhythm that mirrored, with unnerving precision, the predicted perihelion passage of a rogue comet, designated C/2024X1, a celestial wanderer that had been on a trajectory towards our solar system for millennia. This comet wasn't just any comet. Its orbit was highly elliptical, bringing it unusually close to the Sun, and therefore unusually close to us. Astronomers had flagged it as a potential hazard, a distant threat, but nothing more. But the data suggested otherwise. The anomaly's energy readings spiked precisely when C/2024X1 was expected to reach its closest point to the Sun. It wasn't a passive observer. It was a response, or worse, a preparation. The ancient intelligence, whatever it was using the comet's passage. My breath hitched. I zoomed in on the spectral analysis of the anomaly's emissions. There were subharmonics, frequencies I hadn't been able to resolve before, buried deep within the noise. They formed a sequence that, when translated into a simple binary code, yielded a series of astronomical coordinates. My hands trembled as I plotted them. They weren't pointing to distant galaxies or nebulae. They were pointing inward, to specific points within our own solar system, and one point, in particular, glowed with an insistent, malevolent luminescence on my holographic star chart. It was Earth. Not just Earth, but a specific region. A region I recognized with a sickening lurch. The coordinates resolved to the geographic location of the Mariana Trench, the place where the pressure was so immense it could crush a submarine like a tin can. The place where light had never touched. The metallic tang in the air intensified, making me gag. It was no longer just a smell. It was a taste of something ancient and foul, something that had been waiting for the right celestial alignment, waiting for the rogue comet to act as a key or a herald. I stared at the glowing blue sphere of Earth on my screen, the pinpoint of light marking the Mariana Trench pulsing like a dying heart. The anomaly wasn't just a cosmic curiosity. It was a beacon, and it was calling something, or preparing to do something. The wind outside howled, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the weight of eons. I felt a profound, crushing loneliness, a realization that I was privy to a truth too terrible to bear, a truth that would shatter the fragile peace of the world. It was a trap. What was coming? It was strongest in my study, here in this remote village in valley, single road in and out, where the air itself seemed to thicken with the unseen. The data streams, once crisp lines of light on my monitor, now pulsed with a sickly, jaundiced hue, like old bruises blooming across the digital expanse. My fingers, stained a faint rust color from countless hours spent poring over spectral analyses, trembled as I traced the impassable curves. This wasn't noise. This was a signature. I needed to tell someone. The thought clawed at me, a desperate scrabbling against the encroaching silence. Who? My colleagues, scattered across the globe, would dismiss it as burnout, the grief finally fracturing my scientific rigor. They'd seen the toll Sarah's absence had taken, the way I'd retreated into the cold certainty of numbers. The village elder, a wizened man with eyes like polished obsidian, was my only hope. He sat by the hearth in his small, smoke-filled dwelling, the scent of burning pine needles and something earthy, like damp soil, clinging to him. I'd brought him a small offering of dried fruit, a gesture of respect I'd learned from the few remaining villagers who still clung to their ancient ways. "Elder," I began, my voice raspy, unfamiliar even to myself. I held out a printout of the anomalous data, the impassable waveforms stark against the white paper. "I believe I have found something profound, something that changes everything we understand about the universe." He took the paper, his gnarled fingers surprisingly steady. He didn't look at the data. Instead, his gaze drifted past me, towards the single, dusty window that framed the deepening twilight. "The sky bleeds," he said, his voice a low rumble like stones shifting deep underground. I leaned forward, my heart racing a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "What do I mean? I've been observing. Patterns, anomalies. They're not natural, they suggest. Intention." He finally looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not understanding, but a vast, ancient weariness. The old ones spoke of such times, when the veil thins. "I'm talking about quantifiable data, Elder, evidence." He let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "Evidence is for those who can still grasp it. I see the patterns, Thomas, I see the numbers shifting. But do I feel the pull, the hunger?" My hands clenched into fists. Hunger. The data wasn't hungry. It was a signal, a communication, or worse, a warning. I feel a profound disturbance. Something vast and ancient is stirring, and it's looking this way. The elder slowly shook his head. He handed the printout back to me, his touch surprisingly cool. "The valley is protected, the old ways hold, but the sky is a hungry mouth, and I have been staring too long into its maw." He turned back to the fire, his posture a silent dismissal. I stood there, the paper crinkling in my damp palm, the metallic tang in the air suddenly suffocating. He didn't believe me, or rather, he believed me, but his belief was couched in myth, in ancient fears that offered no tangible solution. He saw omens. I saw a scientific crisis of unimaginable proportions. The village, usually a place of quiet solitude, felt alien, hostile. I was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone with a truth no one else could or would acknowledge. Back in my study, the monitors hummed, their sickly glow illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The data streams pulsed, faster now, more insistent. The coppery scent intensified, sharp and acrid. I looked at the waveform again, the impassable peaks and valleys that spoke of something utterly alien, utterly indifferent. The elder had spoken of a hungry mouth. It wasn't just observing. It was digesting. And the closer it got, the more reality itself would fray, unraveling like a cheap garment. My gaze fell on the photograph of Sarah on my desk, her smile bright, her eyes full of life. A wave of grief, sharp and sudden, threatened to overwhelm me. But beneath it, a steely resolve hardened. I wouldn't let this thing consume everything, not Sarah's memory, not my world. I ran a new diagnostic, pushing the spectral analyzers to their limits. The raw data flooded in, a flood of impassable readings. And within it, buried deep, I found it. A new pattern, a resonance. It wasn't just a signature anymore. It was a focus. It was aimed at me, or at this remote village in valley, single road in and out, a speck of dust in its unfathomable gaze. The monitors flickered, the waveforms distorting, as if struggling to contain the immensity of what was being revealed. What was it trying to communicate, or what was it trying to do? The air in the remote village in valley, single road in and out, had grown heavy, a palpable pressure that pressed down on my chest. It wasn't just the altitude, or the lingering scent of wood smoke and damp earth. It was something else, something ancient and vast that had finally begun to stir. The data I'd painstakingly pieced together, the whispers from the void, they were no longer theoretical. They were here. I'd retreated to the small, sparsely furnished room I'd commandeered. The single window offered a sliver of the bruised twilight sky. Outside, the wind had picked up, a mournful keening that seemed to weave through the gnarled pines surrounding the village. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes, turning familiar objects into monstrous shapes. My hands trembled as I traced the patterns on the worn wooden table. Each grain felt like a thread in a tapestry I was desperately trying to unpick. He spoke of the old ways, of appeasing forces that had no place in my world of equations and spectral lines. But I saw it in his face, the sudden horror. He knew. He felt it too. The universe wasn't just indifferent, it was awake, and it was looking. A sudden, sharp rap on the door made me jump. My breath hitched. I hadn't expected anyone. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I forced myself to stand, my legs feeling like lead. The metallic tang, so faint before, was stronger now, like ozone mixed with something sickly sweet. "Thomas!" A voice called, muffled by the thick wood. It was the innkeeper, a stout woman whose usual jovial demeanor had been replaced by a nervous tremor. "Yes," my voice cracked. "The sky," she stammered, her voice laced with fear. "It's not right." I moved to the window, my gaze drawn upwards. The twilight was deepening, but it wasn't the gentle descent into night. The sky was shifting, not with clouds, but with something intrinsic, something that rippled like disturbed water. Patches of deepest indigo bled into swirling nebulae of unnatural, phosphorescent green. Stars, usually sharp pinpricks of light, seemed to stretch and distort, their familiar constellations dissolving into abstract, unsettling forms. It was like looking at a painting that was actively being remade by an unseen, malevolent artist. A low hum began to permeate the air, a sound that vibrated not just in my ears, but in my very bones. It was a deep, resonant thrumming, like the groan of a colossal, unseen mechanism grinding into motion. Only the unholy glow from the sky provided illumination. Panic clawed at my throat. This was it. The anomaly wasn't just in the data, it was a physical manifestation. The cosmic intelligence I'd theorized about was reaching out, its very presence warping the fabric of our reality. I stumbled back from the window, my hands instinctively reaching for the worn leather satchel containing my notes, my calculations, my desperate plea. The hum intensified, a physical force now, pressing against my eardrums. The floorboards beneath my feet vibrated. Outside, I could hear shouts, the panicked bleating of unseen animals. The remote village in valley, single road in and out, a place that had felt so blessedly isolated, was now a fragile bubble on the precipice of something unimaginable. I remembered the last equation, the one that had sent shivers down my spine when I'd first derived it. It wasn't a prediction of a phenomenon, it was a description of a presence. A conscious entity, vast beyond measure, whose very thoughts could ripple through space-time. And I had, through my obsessive pursuit, drawn its attention. Had she known, the thought was a fresh stab of grief, but it also ignited a desperate resolve. I wouldn't let this thing consume everything. Not now, not when I finally understood. I fumbled for the small, heavy object I'd kept with me, a memento from my early research, a piece of a meteorite I'd once studied for its unusual isotopic composition. The walls of the room seemed to shimmer, as if they too were losing their solidity. I had to do something. The data pointed to a singular, immense convergence, a point where the entity's influence would be most potent, most destructive. It was a place I dismissed as a statistical anomaly in the background radiation, a cosmic blind spot. But now I knew it was a focal point, a doorway. My mind raced, piecing together the fragmented clues, the patterns that had eluded me for so long. The readings weren't random fluctuations. They were messages, and I had finally deciphered the most terrifying one of all. I grabbed my satchel, the meteorite fragment clutched tight. The innkeeper's door burst open, revealing her terrified face silhouetted against the unearthly light. "Thomas, the road. It's gone." I didn't look. I couldn't. The only road in and out of this remote village in valley, single road in and out, was, according to her, no longer there. What lay beyond the warped sky, beyond the vibrating earth, was now the only path forward, but towards what? The silence was the first thing that struck me. Not the absence of sound, but a new kind of quiet. It was deeper, heavier, like the air itself had been thickened with an invisible, oppressive substance. The wind, which had been a frantic howl moments before, was now a low, guttural sigh. It brushed against my skin, not with cold, but with a strange, oily warmth. I opened my eyes. The sky. It was no longer a fractured mosaic of impassable geometries. It was a bruised, sickly purple, bleeding into shades of ochre at the edges of my vision. The stars were gone, not just hidden by clouds, but utterly absent, as if the very concept of distant light had been erased. The familiar constellations, the ones I'd spent my life charting, were replaced by vast, swirling patterns that pulsed with an inner, sickly luminescence. They weren't static. They shifted like ink in water, coalescing and dissolving in slow, nauseating undulations. My breath hitched. I tried to draw a deep, steadying breath, but it felt like inhaling dust. My lungs burned. The ground beneath my feet, which had shuddered and buckled with terrifying force, was now unnervingly still. Yet it felt wrong. The texture of the earth had changed. It was smoother, almost polished, with a faint, iridescent sheen that caught the lurid light of the sky. The single road in and out of this remote village in valley, the only artery connecting us to what I once considered the real world, was gone. Not just destroyed, but unmade. Where it had been, there was now a gentle slope of that same unnervingly smooth, iridescent ground, leading off into a landscape that defied all logic. Buildings, once familiar structures of wood and stone, now stood in impassable angles. Some leaned precariously, their roofs tilted at 45-degree angles, yet they didn't fall. Others seemed to have partially melted into the ground, their walls rippling like fabric caught in a phantom breeze. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth was replaced by a metallic tang, sharp and acrid like ozone mixed with something organic, something decaying, but not in a way I could identify. My hands trembled. I looked down at them, expecting to see them warped alien. They were my hands, the same calloused fingers, the same lines etched into my palms. But they felt detached, as if I were merely observing them from a distance. I flexed them, the movement sluggish, like trying to swim through thick syrup. My body felt heavy, anchored to this new, warped reality by an unseen force. This was a presence. I could feel it, a distant hum in the very fabric of existence, a consciousness so immense it dwarfed stars. It had seen me. It had noticed. And in its noticing, it had reshaped everything. A low, resonant thrumming began, emanating from the very air. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but one that vibrated through my bones, through my teeth. It was a song of creation and destruction, a lullaby sung by a cosmic entity that cared nothing for the fragile order we had imposed upon the universe. My scientific mind, once my solace, now offered no comfort. The equations, the theories, the very laws of physics I had dedicated my life to understanding were nothing more than quaint fictions in the face of this truth. I stumbled forward, my legs protesting, my body a reluctant puppet. Where was I going? There was no destination, only this altered landscape stretching out before me. The path I had followed, the one that led me to the precipice of understanding, had dissolved. Now, there was only the unknown, an unknown that had been actively, deliberately sculpted into a new, terrifying form. My gaze swept across the warped village, searching for any sign of life, any echo of what had been. There was nothing. No movement, no sound beyond that pervasive, bone-deep thrum. The sickly purple sky seemed to press lower, the swirling patterns within it intensifying, their pulses growing faster, more insistent. I remembered Sarah's face, her laughter. It felt like a memory from another lifetime, a life that had existed before the sky had bled and the ground had smoothed. Was she gone, or was she changed? The entity, this vast intelligence, had not just altered the world. It had rewritten existence. And I was left to wander its new, alien creation, a ghost in a universe that was no longer my own. What could I possibly do now? How could I even begin to comprehend what had been done, or what was yet to come? The silence pressed in. It wasn't just the absence of the storm's rage, but a profound stillness that felt expectant. The wind, a moment ago a banshee's shriek, now merely whispered, a sibilant breath against the corrugated iron roof of the abandoned warehouse I'd found shelter in. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the unnatural quiet. I'd followed the signal here to this forgotten pocket of the world. The data hadn't lied. It never lied. It was just the truth it showed me was a horror I hadn't been equipped to face. My wife, Alina, her laughter, the way she traced constellations on my palm, those were the stars I'd navigated by. Now, the sky was a tapestry woven from something else entirely, something ancient and indifferent and terrifyingly aware. My fingers, still slick with the condensation that had formed on the cold metal of my equipment, fumbled with the recalcitrant latch of my case. It was the only thing that felt alive, or at least not unalive. It was my beacon, my anchor, and my torment. The readings were still fluctuating, not erratically, but with a deliberate, rhythmic pulse. I remembered the first anomaly, a flicker in the background radiation that shouldn't have been there. Then another, and another. It was like staring into a mirror and seeing not my reflection, but the impossible geometry of a universe that had been rearranged, subtly, irrevocably, by an unseen hand. The wind outside picked up again, but it was different now. It carried a scent, something acrid and metallic, like ozone mixed with decay. It seeped through the cracks in the warehouse walls, a tangible intrusion. My skin prickled. It was a feeling of being observed, not by eyes, but by something far more pervasive, something that perceived me as a single cell in a vast, incomprehensible organism. I adjusted the lens on my portable telescope, aiming it towards a patch of sky I'd identified from the readings. The stars were there, the familiar constellations, but they seemed muted. Then I saw it, or rather I felt it, a distortion. Not a lensing effect, but a ripple, as if the fabric of space itself had been momentarily disturbed. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving me questioning my own senses. Was this the culmination, the final, terrible revelation? The readings had been pointing to a nexus, a point where the influence was strongest, and that point impassably was here. In this remote village in Valley, single road in and out. The single road. I'd seen it on the satellite images. A thin, grey scar leading into this forgotten place, and just one leading out. A trap, or a gateway. I brought the telescope back, my hands trembling. The device on the table pulsed again, its hum deepening. It was reacting to something, a shift in the ambient energy. I could feel it now, a pressure behind my eyes, a subtle disorientation. The walls seemed to waver at the edges of my vision. I thought of Alina again. She'd seen it too, hadn't she? Before the illness took her, before she faded like a distant star. I hadn't understood. I'd been too lost in my own grief, too focused on the predictable laws of physics. The hum of the device escalated, becoming a whine that vibrated in my teeth. The flashlight beam flickered, threatening to die. Outside, the wind had stopped altogether. The silence was absolute, a physical weight pressing down. I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. My heart hammered, a frantic, futile drumbeat against the encroaching stillness. I looked at the device. The lights on its console were no longer blinking. They were a steady, unwavering glow, a single, intense point of luminescence. It was transmitting or receiving. Or perhaps it was simply a conduit, a lens for the unimaginable. It wasn't a solid shape, but a distortion, a negative space that seemed to absorb the faint light. It moved with an unnerving fluidity, not walking, but flowing. My breath caught. I couldn't scream. It was coming towards me, towards the device, towards me. It was the intelligence, or a part of it, manifested. Or perhaps I was merely perceiving a fraction of its true form, a projection that my limited mind could barely process. The single road in and out. The remote village in Valley, single road in and out. This was it, the end of the line. But not for me, not in the way I'd imagined. The universe hadn't just been rearranged. It had been claimed. And I was standing at the precipice of its new order. I could feel its alien awareness, an immense, ancient consciousness that regarded me with the same disinterest it might regard a speck of dust. What was it going to do? What was it doing? The air crackled. My vision swam. It didn't touch the device, but seemed to envelop it, the light of its console intensifying, then extinguishing. Absolute. What had been unleashed?